He checked his phone for the 10th time. She wasn't coming. His blind date had stood him up. But when two terrified little girls came running out of the darkness screaming, "They beat our mom, she's dying," everything changed. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity. The wait. Marcus Chen adjusted his tie for the 3rd time, checking his phone again. 7:35. She was now 20 minutes late. The restaurant buzzed with Friday night energy around him. Couples laughing over wine, the clinking of glasses creating a symphony of normalcy he suddenly felt excluded from. His best friend Jake had sworn this blind date would be different, that Sarah was absolutely perfect for him. Marcus had been skeptical but hopeful. After 2 years of failed relationships and endless dating apps, he'd agreed to give blind dates one more chance. He'd even bought a new tie for the occasion, a deep blue one that Jake said brought out his eyes. Now that tie felt like a noose as he sat alone at a candlelit table meant for romance. The waiter approached with that sympathetic look servers reserve for people being stood up. Marcus waved him off, ordering another water, his 3rd. His phone showed no new messages, no apologetic texts explaining a delay, no frantic calls about traffic or emergencies. The reservation was for 8, and he'd arrived 15 minutes early, wanting to make a good first impression, wanting to be the gentleman his mother had raised him to be. Now he felt like a fool, sitting alone at a table set for 2, watching other diners steal pitying glances when they thought he wasn't looking. A couple at the next table was celebrating an anniversary, their laughter and easy affection making his isolation feel even more pronounced. He'd give it until 8, he decided. Then he'd salvage what was left of his Friday night, maybe grab takeout from that Thai place he loved, and lose himself in a movie at home. At least his dignity would remain somewhat intact, and his cat wouldn't judge him for being stood up. Marcus thought about Sarah's profile picture that Jake had shown him. She had kind eyes and a warm smile, a single mother who worked as a nurse. Jake had met her at the hospital when his wife had their baby, had been impressed by her compassion and humor during a difficult delivery. "She's genuine, Marcus," Jake had said. "Not like those Instagram wannabes you keep matching with. She's real, she's got her life together, and she deserves a good guy. You two would be perfect together." Marcus had wanted to believe him, had allowed himself to hope that maybe this time would be different. But here he was again, alone, the familiar sting of rejection settling into his chest like an old friend he'd rather not know. As 8 o'clock approached, Marcus signaled for the check. The waiter brought it wordlessly, his expression a mixture of pity and understanding, probably having witnessed this scene play out countless times before. Marcus left cash on the table, more than enough to cover his 3 waters and compensate for taking up prime real estate on a busy Friday night. He stood, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the exit with as much dignity as he could muster. He stepped out into the cool September evening, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement from an earlier rain that had left the air smelling clean and fresh. The street was alive with people heading to bars, theaters, dates of their own, living their lives while his evening crumbled into disappointment. He pulled out his phone to call an Uber, ready to retreat to the safety of his apartment, when he heard them, 2 small voices crying out in panic, growing louder as they approached, about to change everything he thought he knew about this terrible, disappointing night. 2 identical little girls, no more than 6 years old, came running down the sidewalk toward him through the rain, their small sneakers splashing through puddles, their faces streaked with tears and absolute terror. They wore matching pink jackets, now splattered with something dark and wet that made Marcus's stomach drop with sickening recognition. Before he could fully process what was happening, they crashed into him, their small hands desperately clutching his suit sleeves with surprising strength born of panic. "Please, mister, please help us," one of them sobbed, her voice breaking with hysteria. "They beat our mom. She's dying. Please, you have to help." The other twin was crying so hard she could barely form words, just pointing frantically back the way they'd come with a trembling hand, her entire small body shaking with sobs that seemed too large for her tiny frame. Marcus felt his heart slam against his rib cage as he dropped to one knee on the wet pavement, bringing himself to their eye level, his previous disappointment about the failed date evaporating instantly in the face of their raw terror. Slow down," he said. trying to keep his voice calm and steady despite his own rising panic. "Where is your mom? What happened? Tell me exactly where she is." The calmer twin, though still shaking violently and gasping for air between sobs, managed to get the words out in broken fragments. "The alley. Back there. 2 men. They have knives. They hurt Mommy really bad. She's bleeding. Mommy told us to run and get help. She told us to find someone. Please, mister, please help her." Her identical sister nodded frantically, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks, unable to speak but confirming every word with desperate nods. Marcus pulled out his phone with shaking hands, already dialing 911 as he looked in the direction they'd pointed. A narrow alley cut between 2 buildings about 50 yards away, dark and seemingly empty from this distance, but something about the shadows within made his blood run cold. The operator answered on the second ring, and Marcus quickly relayed the information, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the adrenaline now flooding his system like electricity through his veins. "I'm at Maple and 3rd. There's been an assault in the alley between Antonio's restaurant and the jewelry store. 2 suspects, possibly armed with knives. Female victim, condition unknown. 2 children present, approximately 6 years old." He could hear his own voice sounding strangely calm, professional even, as if his old paramedic training was kicking in automatically. "Stay on the line," the operator instructed firmly. "Officers are being dispatched to your location. ETA 3 minutes. Do not approach the suspects. Keep the children safe and wait for police arrival." Marcus looked down at the twins clinging to him, then back at the dark alley entrance. 3 minutes. Every second counted when someone was bleeding. He'd taken self-defense classes at the gym, had been in a few fights in his youth, but this was different. This was real danger, real weapons, and somewhere in that darkness a woman was hurt and possibly dying while her daughters stood here pleading with a stranger. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to wait for police, to keep the children safe, and not become another victim in this nightmare. But another part, the part that had driven him to become a paramedic before switching to software engineering, the part that couldn't watch someone suffer without trying to help, couldn't stand by while someone bled out waiting for help that might arrive too late. Marcus made a split-second decision that would change 4 lives forever. He pulled the twins close, gripping their small shoulders gently but firmly, and looked directly into their identical brown eyes, forcing himself to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice steady and authoritative, the tone a parent uses when a child's safety depends on following instructions exactly. "I need you to stay right here on this sidewalk where people can see you, right under this streetlight. Don't move from this spot for any reason. The police are coming in just a few minutes. Can you be brave and do that for me?" The twins nodded, still crying but visibly trying to compose themselves, their small faces showing determination breaking through the terror. He pointed to the restaurant he'd just been stood up in, the irony not lost on him even in this moment. "See that restaurant right there with all the lights? If you get scared, if anyone approaches you, run straight inside and tell them to call the police again. Tell them Marcus sent you, okay?" They nodded again, more firmly this time, and he saw something in their eyes shift. They were choosing to trust this stranger completely, placing their mother's life in his hands. Marcus stood, his phone still connected to the 911 operator, who was repeating warnings he could barely hear over the pounding of his heart, and started toward the alley with measured, purposeful steps. "I'm approaching the scene now," he said quietly into the phone, his voice taking on the professional tone from his paramedic days. 2 children reported their mother being assaulted by 2 male suspects, possibly armed with knives. The victim has been down for approximately 5 minutes. I have medical training. The operator's voice became more urgent, almost pleading. "Sir, I strongly advise you not to approach. This is a dangerous situation with armed suspects. Officers are 1 minute out. Please wait for—" But Marcus was already at the alley entrance, tucking his phone into his pocket but keeping the line connected, his eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering light from a single overhead bulb 20 feet in. The scene that materialized before him made his blood run cold. 2 men, one massive and wearing a gray hoodie, the other lean in a leather jacket, were standing over a woman crumpled on the wet ground like discarded clothing. They were rifling through her purse, laughing about something, the casual cruelty of their laughter making Marcus's hands clench into fists. The woman wasn't moving at all, lying motionless in a dark pool that could only be blood spreading across the pavement. One of the attackers looked up, his laughter dying as he spotted Marcus silhouetted at the alley entrance. "Yo, we got company," he said to his partner, his voice carrying a threat, and both men turned to face him fully, revealing the knives they held. Not small pocket knives, but serious weapons. One a hunting knife with a serrated edge, the other a switchblade that caught the dim light menacingly. Marcus felt his legs want to turn and run, felt every survival instinct screaming at him to wait for the police. But he thought of those two little girls and forced himself to stand his ground. He raised his phone high, making sure they could see the glowing screen clearly. "Police are on their way. They're less than 1 minute out. I'm on the line with 911 right now, and they have this location. Leave now, and maybe you'll get away. Stay, and you're done." His voice was surprisingly calm, controlled, channeling every ounce of authority he could muster, the opposite of the terror coursing through his veins. The two men exchanged glances, and Marcus could hear sirens now, still distant but approaching, growing louder with each passing second. The standoff held for what felt like an eternity. 3 men frozen in a moment that could explode into violence. Then the larger attacker spat on the ground near the woman's body. "This ain't worth it, man. Let's go," he muttered. And both men suddenly bolted deeper into the alley, their footsteps echoing as they disappeared through what must have been a back exit into the darkness beyond. Marcus didn't wait, didn't celebrate, just rushed forward and dropped to his knees beside the motionless woman, his hands already reaching to check for a pulse. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Help is coming. Stay with me." Marcus gently turned the woman's face toward what little light filtered into the alley from the distant street lamp, his hands trembling slightly as he brushed blood-matted hair away from her features. And his breath caught in his throat so suddenly it felt like someone had punched him in the chest, even with blood matting her dark shoulder-length hair, even with her face already swelling from the brutal beating, even with the bruising beginning to purple around her eyes and cheekbone. He recognized her instantly. Sarah Mitchell. The profile picture Jake had shown him didn't do her justice, but those features were unmistakable. The same gentle curve of her jaw, the same small nose, the same woman who was supposed to meet him for dinner 25 minutes ago. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief and horror, his fingers finding the pulse point on her neck. Weak and thready, but present, thank God, still present. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of her name, unfocused and glazed with pain and confusion, struggling to make sense of the face hovering above her in the darkness. My babies," she managed to whisper through split and swollen lips, each word clearly causing her agony, her hand weakly trying to rise as if to reach for her daughters. "They're safe," Marcus assured her quickly, his paramedic training taking over even as his mind reeled from the impossible coincidence. "Your girls found me. They're incredible, Sarah. They were so brave. They're waiting right outside on the sidewalk where people can see them, where it's safe and lit. The police are almost here. Just stay with me. Don't try to move. You might have internal injuries, broken ribs, maybe a collapsed lung from the way you're breathing." His hands moved automatically, doing a rapid assessment even as he spoke to keep her conscious and calm. Possible broken ribs given the shallow breathing and the way she flinched when he gently palpated her side. Definite concussion from the head trauma and the unfocused eyes. Lacerations on her arms and hands where she'd clearly tried to defend herself and her children from the attack. Her breathing was shallow but steady, which was good, and the bleeding from her head wound seemed to have slowed, though the amount of blood on the ground made his stomach turn. "I was coming to meet you," Sarah whispered suddenly, tears mixing with blood on her bruised cheeks, creating pink trails down to her jaw. "Cut through the alley. Stupid shortcut. I'm so sorry, Marcus. The girls were with me. I was taking them to my mom's house first. We were running late. Emma couldn't find her stuffed bear. I thought this alley would save time. I've walked through here dozens of times." Her voice broke completely, and he could see the guilt and self-blame washing over her even through her pain. Marcus felt something twist painfully in his chest. A mixture of anger at the men who did this, relief that she was alive, and an overwhelming protective tenderness for this woman he'd never actually met until this moment. She'd been trying to make it to their date, had taken a shortcut because she was running late and didn't want to stand him up, and had been attacked for it. The twins, her daughters, had been with her, had witnessed their mother being beaten, had been terrified beyond measure, and somehow Sarah had found the strength and presence of mind to push them away and tell them to run for help, even while being brutally assaulted. "Don't apologize," Marcus said firmly, his voice thick with emotion as he stripped off his suit jacket despite the cool rain and carefully wadded it under her head as a makeshift pillow, trying to keep her neck stable. "You have absolutely nothing to be sorry for, Sarah, nothing. This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. Those men, they're responsible, not you. You saved your daughters' lives by getting them away. You're a hero." Police cars screeched to a halt at the alley entrance behind him, red and blue lights suddenly flooding the narrow space with strobing illumination. And moments later, officers were swarming in with weapons drawn, followed closely by paramedics with their equipment. Marcus moved aside automatically to let the professionals work, but he stayed close, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face even as the EMTs began their rapid assessment and treatment. One of the twins, he still couldn't tell Lily from Emma, broke free from a young police officer who'd been keeping them safe and ran toward the alley entrance. "Mommy, Mommy!" Marcus caught her gently before she could interfere with the paramedics' critical work, kneeling down and wrapping his arms around her small, trembling body, holding her close as she sobbed into his blood-stained shirt, her sister appearing moments later to join them, and he held them both, these two brave little girls who'd saved their mother's life by finding him. 6 hours later, Marcus sat in the surgical waiting room at St. Mary's Hospital, the harsh fluorescent lights making everything feel surreal and timeless. The twins asleep on the chairs beside him like bookends, one on each side, their small heads resting on his shoulders, their breathing finally slow and steady after hours of crying and terror. Lily's hand was tucked into his left hand, Emma's small fingers curled around his right, even in sleep needing that physical connection to know they were safe. Their grandmother was driving in from 2 states away, a frantic 7-hour journey through the night, and wouldn't arrive until morning at the earliest, maybe later depending on traffic. Sarah had been rushed into emergency surgery almost immediately upon arrival. The ER doctors grave-faced as they'd explained internal bleeding and a collapsed lung, possibly a ruptured spleen, broken ribs that had punctured tissue, injuries that could have been fatal if Marcus had arrived even 15 minutes later. The police had taken his statement while Sarah was in surgery, had assured him they had excellent leads on the attackers from surveillance cameras positioned at the alley's entrance, had even told him the cameras had captured him confronting the suspects, had called him brave, had used the word hero multiple times. Marcus didn't feel like a hero sitting in this sterile waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee. He felt like a man who'd been in the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong place depending on how you looked at it. A man whose failed blind date had somehow positioned him exactly where 2 terrified little girls would find him when they needed help most desperately. The twins had told him and the police everything through their tears, their identical voices overlapping as they recounted the nightmare in heartbreaking detail. Their mother had been taking them to their grandma's house before going to meet a nice man for dinner that Uncle Jake told her about, they'd explained. They'd been running late because Emma couldn't find her favorite stuffed animal, a worn pink elephant she'd had since birth, and had insisted on searching the entire house before leaving. Sarah had decided to cut through the alley she'd walked through dozens of times before, a shortcut she'd used regularly, not knowing that tonight 2 predators had chosen that same dark space to wait for victims. When the men had attacked, appearing suddenly from behind the dumpster like monsters from a nightmare, Sarah had immediately pushed her daughters behind her, had fought back with everything she had, scratching and kicking and screaming, but there had been 2 of them with weapons, and she'd been quickly overwhelmed, beaten down to the ground with brutal efficiency. Even as they'd hit her, even as the knife had flashed and she'd felt ribs crack, Sarah had found the strength to scream at her girls to run, to get help, to find someone, anyone. Lily and Emma had run blindly, tears streaming, until they'd seen Marcus standing outside the restaurant looking sad and alone, And something about him, maybe his kind face, maybe his nice suit, maybe just desperate instinct, had told them he would help. A surgeon emerged from the double doors at 2 a.m, still wearing scrubs splattered with Sarah's blood, a surgical mask pulled down around his neck, and Marcus gently woke the twins with soft touches to their shoulders. "She's stable," the surgeon said with a tired but genuine smile, his eyes crinkling with relief. "The surgery went well. She has a long recovery ahead of her, 3 broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone. The internal injuries we repaired, including a grade 3 splenic laceration, significant soft tissue trauma, but she's going to make it. She's extremely lucky. Another 30 minutes without medical intervention and the internal bleeding could have been fatal. You saved her life." Marcus felt the tension that had been holding his spine rigid for 6 hours, suddenly drained from his body so completely he almost collapsed forward, his breath coming out in a shaky exhale he hadn't known he was holding. Lily and Emma burst into fresh tears beside him, but these were tears of relief and joy, their small faces transforming from the haunted expressions they'd worn all night to something approaching hope. "Can we see her?" Emma asked in the smallest voice Marcus had ever heard, looking up at the surgeon with those huge brown eyes, still red-rimmed and swollen. "Please, we need to see our mommy." 3 months later, Marcus stood at the same restaurant where he'd been stood up, but this time Sarah was across from him, smiling despite the small scar that now marked her cheekbone. She was beautiful, even more so than her profile picture had suggested. They'd been on several dates since she'd recovered enough to leave the house, but she'd insisted they have a proper do-over of their original blind date at the same place. The twins were with their grandmother tonight, giving Sarah and Marcus an evening alone. "I keep thinking about how different everything could have been," Sarah said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "If you'd left 5 minutes earlier, if the girls had run the other direction, if you hadn't been brave enough to help." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I keep thinking about how I almost didn't come at all that night. Jake had to practically drag me out of my apartment. I'd convinced myself blind dates were a waste of time." He laughed, shaking his head at the irony. "Worst blind date ever, but somehow it led to this." Sarah laughed too, the sound like music. Her recovery had been difficult, both physically and emotionally. The nightmares still came sometimes, the fear of alleys and dark places, but therapy was helping, and having Marcus in her life, someone who understood what she'd been through because he'd been there, made all the difference. "The girls adore you." "You know," Sarah said, her eyes warm, "they've started calling you our hero Marcus. Emma wants you to come to her school's career day to talk about being brave." Marcus felt his throat tighten. Over the past 3 months, he'd fallen in love not just with Sarah, but with her daughters too. Family dinners, movie nights, helping with homework. It had all felt so natural, so right. He'd never imagined himself as a father figure, but with Lily and Emma, it just made sense. They'd been through trauma together, had bonded in the crucible of that terrible night, and had come through it as something resembling a family. "I love them too," Marcus said simply. "I love all 3 of you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she whispered. The waiter approached their table, and this time there was no pity in his eyes, only warmth as he took their order. Marcus looked around the restaurant, at the same tables and chairs, the same lighting, the same city visible through the windows. Everything looked the same, but his entire world had transformed. Sometimes the worst moments of your life, he thought, could lead to the best ones. Sometimes getting stood up for a blind date meant you were exactly where you needed to be to save the person you were meant to find. Thank you for being part of the Drew Daily Stories family. Your support means everything, and your stories inspire us to keep sharing tales of human goodness. See you in the next video.